Greetings. I'd like to spend a little time discussing the O.J. Simpson case of 1994. Ask anyone over the age of 35 what they remember about the O.J. Simpson case and see what they say. My guess is if you ask a bunch of people, a lot of people first will tell you their opinion whether he was guilty or not guilty, and then also you'll hear about the Bronco chase. And maybe you'll hear some other things. Ask them if they remember who the players were in this case, if they remember any specifics from the case, something about a glove. And you'll probably get some people who will tell you all kinds of things. For example, where they were when the verdict, when the jury, came out with their um, their verdict. Basically, I remember I was teaching at a community college and they had all the televisions on because it was going to be announced. And I just kind of was walking around and went into the cafeteria, and people were glued to a bunch of big screen televisions that were around and waiting and waiting. And when they heard that the jury had Judge O.J. Simpson not guilty, I heard cheering and I heard booing. I heard arguing, I heard yelling, I heard screaming. People were happy, people were sad. And I just sat back and observed and wondered, how do I make sense of all this? What does this mean about the criminal justice system? What seems to be these factors that led this to be such a intriguing trial and crime, a crime of the century, if you will? Going back a little bit, really, if we start on June 12th, 1994, in Los Angeles, in a upscale suburb called Brentwood, um, someone killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Nicole Brown Simpson was the ex-wife of O.J. Simpson, and Ronald Goldman was a waiter who was returning a pair of glasses that had been left by Nicole's family at the restaurant where he was working. So Ronald Goldman may have been, if this was planned for someone had planned to kill Nicole Simpson, Mr. Goldman was in a very unfortunate situation to be at a place where a crime scene was planned to occur. So of course, we start there and thinking about, was this a spontaneous murder, or was this something that was planned out ahead of time? And that will later come into play when looking at the evidence and looking at the prosecution and defense attorneys' presentations. Additionally, the Simpson children, young children, were asleep inside um, the home of Ms. Nicole Brown. And this, of course, will come into play later as well. The murder took place in the front gate area, and both of the victims had been severely slashed. Also, it was a little bit after midnight that a neighbor called the police, or I'm sorry, discovered Nicole Simpson's uh, dog howling and covered in blood, and then discovered the bodies and called the police. And thus we have the beginning of the case. We'll see that O.J. Simpson was on his way um, out of state that evening, flying out of the airport to conduct some business, and would then return upon hearing his ex-wife had been killed. We'll also see that there's a lot of disputes over the jury. 12 members of the jury, 8 African American and 2 white women, 1 African American and 1 Latino man. All were Democrats, 2 were college graduates. None had read the paper regularly. 9 rented homes. 8 watched TV tabloid shows. 5 had family that had had negative interactions with police. And 9 thought that O.J. Simpson was less likely to be a murderer because he was a football player. And what you're going to see come into play here and throughout this whole case is this whole idea of of jury consultation and the science of jury selection and the science of analyzing juries. In some sense, that if you wanted to become a jury consultant, one of the things you would do, of course, is to go through training, and you'd also review the social science literature. For example, if you look at the General Social Survey, the GSS, studies all kinds of behaviors, opinions, attitudes of a random sample of the United States population. And if you looked at other public opinion polls that look at attitudes and opinions about crimes and the like, you could begin to construct what type of person demographically would be more likely to convict someone or not, and how they view crime, and so on. And so you might find out that age, gender, race, and ethnicity, income, education, and other factors become relevant, and this can all be used in this jury consultation area, which some call science and some call art. And again, I think what you're talking about are probabilities, and you're using large scale data to then try to determine who would be the best jury to select or deselect to get the outcome that you want, depending obviously if you're prosecution or defense. So that's a whole nother area. Also, we see that interpersonal violence comes in here into this case, that there had been a history of domestic violence, and that O.J. Simpson had allegedly beat his wife, Nicole, on multiple occasions. In fact, Nicole Simpson had left a picture in a safe deposit box of her beaten face with an indication that her husband at the time, O.J. Simpson, had done this. So domestic violence became a big issue in this case and in the public. In fact, as your authors point out in your text, there's a 60% increase in domestic violence calls in Los Angeles a year following the trial. I'm not saying domestic violence increased, but calls to domestic violence, shelters, police, and so on. So there's a lot more attention to the issue of domestic violence. Also, what came into play at one point was the relationship between domestic violence and homicide. Now, we know that while those that kill their partner usually have a history of domestic violence, most who engage in domestic violence do not kill their partner. So O.J. Simpson's history of domestic violence perpetration is one risk factor, but the simple explanation that because he had a history of domestic violence, he must have also been engaged in the killing of his ex-wife becomes faulty. It's one risk factor, and there are many risk factors that we'd want to look at. So that's important because that did come up, and you saw, the presentation in one regard that some would say, well, O.J. Simpson had a history of domestic violence, therefore it's very likely he was the murderer, and others say, well, a lot of domestic violence cases we look at, the domestic violence perpetrator does not murder the spouse. So O.J. Simpson had flown to Chicago for business the night that the murders occurred, but it was after the murders had occurred, and he returned to L.A. the next day for police interrogation. They did find that he had a deep cut on one of his hands, and eventually a warrant was issued for his arrest, and we see this famous Bronco chase where he takes off in his Bronco with his buddy, Mr. Cowlings, and who is trying to convince O.J. Simpson to turn him in. O.J. Simpson is contemplating suicide and claims he's going to kill himself. He eventually turns himself in and arrested and placed in jail before and during the trial. And they also find other things too, for example, that become part of the investigation and some of it into the trial. For example, Mr. Simpson had purchased a disguise at a costume shop several weeks prior to the murders to include a goatee and a mustache. Now, Mr. Simpson also is an actor at this point and is well known for a rental car agency advertisement, which of course was pulled, and he apparently made, I think, jazzercise or exercise videos as well, and he had also acted in multiple movies. So, again, a lot of times there's some indicators that we're not sure what they mean. Did he purchase a disguise because he wanted to leave the country after the murders occurred, if one believes he was the murderer? Or did he purchase a disguise because he's an actor and he was going to practice a character? I don't know. I'm just bringing that up. Many claim that the district attorney's office made a huge mistake when they decided to have the trial in downtown Los Angeles instead of Santa Monica. Very different demographics there, and there would have been a very different jury in that sense. Also, the prosecution decided not to seek the death penalty, and we might ask what was the rationale of that. There's a lot of useful information about the trial. Obviously, O.J. Simpson pled not guilty. Mr. Simpson had what was known as 9 attorneys, or the dream team. He had basically some of the most skilled attorneys in practice in their specialty areas. And when you watch some of the court proceedings, you'll indeed see that being the case. So there's a timeline that's created, and then this other character, Kato Kalin, comes into play, and then dropped him off, and Kato Kalin was OJ's friend and helper, I guess. And so between 9:36 and 10:56 p.m., O.J. Simpson claims he was at home, but no one could verify his location. Mr. Park is a limousine driver who picks him up at 10:25. No answer. He didn't see Simpson's Bronco. And then at 10:56, he sees Simpson going in the front door. And then Simpson comes out and says he was in the shower. He loads up his baggage into the limo. Somehow, some way, a bag disappears on the way to an airport. And it's reported by Alan that Simpson is very nervous. Again, what happened to the bag? And was there a bag? And being nervous, was he trying to catch his flight and worried he was going to miss it, or was it something else? We also see a lot of discussion of DNA, and there were 5 major results, and these were all challenged and torn apart by Mr. Barry Scheck, one of O.J. Simpson's attorneys. And by the way, Mr. Scheck now, I think, is very much involved in the Innocence Project and the use of DNA. So, a lot of these individuals you'll see later on did a lot of interesting stuff, in the past 20 years. The DNA was consistent with O.J. Simpson's blood. In other words, there was DNA consistent with O.J. Simpson found in the blood on the walkway at the murder scene and also on the rear gate. Also, there was a glove found at Simpson's house that had the victim's blood on it. There was a sock found in Simpson's house that had Nicole's DNA on it. Their DNA was found in the Bronco that had profiles matching Simpson, Nicole Simpson, O.J. Simpson, Nicole Simpson, and Mr. Goldman. And there were also blood drops on Simpson's driveway with his DNA. Okay, that is amazing findings, but you'll see that each of those are torn apart and criticized in the proceedings. Also, the killer wore a size 12 Bruno Magli shoes, but we did not find out if Simpson had these shoes. And again, we see a lot of criticism. We also find that there was a police officer investigator at the time, Mr. Mark Furman, who is now, I believe he's a Fox commentator today. Anyway, he presented himself in court, and many believe that his behavior and some of the things he said brought in a lot of doubt. And you can read about some of the things that transpired. Now, I'm going to read testimony of Detective Mark Furman that was not heard by the jury, but I think really had an effect. Mr. Ullman, Mr. Ullman's an attorney for O.J. Simpson. Mr. Ullman, Detective Furman, was the testimony that you gave at the preliminary hearings in this case completely truthful? Detective Furman, I wish to assert my Fifth Amendment privilege. Mr. Ullman, have you ever falsified a police report? Detective Furman, I wish to assert my Fifth Amendment privilege. Mr. Ullman, is it your intention to assert your Fifth Amendment privilege with respect to all questions that I may ask you, Detective Furman? Yes. Then Furman's lawyer, Mr. Munger, states, Your Honor, further questions don't serve any purpose since my client has already answered that he will not answer any questions and will assert his Fifth Amendment privilege. Anything further can only be a show. Mr. Ullman, I only have one other question, Your Honor. The court. What was that, Mr. Ullman? Mr. Ullman, Detective Furman, did you plant or manufacture any evidence in this case? Detective Furman, I assert my Fifth Amendment privilege. Very interesting. Moving on, the attorneys became these larger-than-life characters. For example, Marcia Clark, who also is on one of the major stations, always doing consulting work, and I believe she wrote fiction and nonfiction. Christopher Darden, also a prosecutor. Maybe one remembers when O.J. Simpson tries on the so-called killer's glove, and it appears to be too small and doesn't fit him. And I believe it was Mr. Cochran, the defense attorney for O.J. Simpson, says, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. That famous saying. Also, you had Judge Lance Ito, and there was a lot of, critiques of what happened in the courtroom. And then Mr. Shapiro, who I believe now, sells do-it-yourself legal documents. I mentioned Barry Scheck, well-known attorney, expert in DNA evidence. And also, we saw Dr. Henry Lee, who wrote the book Famous Crimes Revisited, along with Dr. Labriola. And he has an extensive chapter on O.J. Simpson here. Dr. Lee did some amazing forensic presentations in the courtroom. I don't know. In my opinion, obviously he knows his science. There's no doubt about that. But I think also he just connects with the people in the courtroom, with the jury, with everyone. He's very likable. And if you watch some of the video on his presentation of evidence, I think that's a nice model that he uses on how to present evidence in the courtroom. And then Mr. Kardashian, who passed away, but Mr. Kardashian may sound familiar to some of you who are familiar with the Kardashian television show with the models or whatever, and Bruce Jenner and all that. That's the father of the famous Kardashian, kids that have a television show, reality show. Some claim the prosecution overtried the case. In other words, they presented too much evidence. And the jury reached their not guilty decision in 3 hours and 40 minutes, and the judge announced it the next day. There was a lot of fears about what would happen after the result came out, the not guilty or guilty decision, that people were trying to figure out what was going to go on there. Later on, a civil suit is filed against O.J. Simpson, and after a 3-month trial in Santa Monica, Simpson's found financially liable for the 2 deaths, and that the families are supposed to receive $8.5 and $25 million for damages, which they don't. And of course, the criminal trial and the civil suit also gets into the whole idea of the criteria, the preponderance of evidence versus beyond a reasonable doubt. And the civil suit obviously got much less attention because there were no courtroom cameras as there was in the criminal trial. So a lot of questions, a lot of interesting features to look at. Also, the public opinion polls show that race, gender, age, education, and income are all these social factors that were related to opinions about whether O.J. Simpson was guilty or not guilty, or if he had a fair trial or not fair trial, or if his wealth played a role, and so on and so forth. So a very, very fascinating case. Those of you who remember this case because you were old enough to watch it and read about it will probably have some memories of this case when you start thinking about it and reading and looking at some of the video clips. And those of you who were um, much younger at the time and didn't, see this case, or weren't even born yet for that matter, then you'll I can tell you this is what everyone was talking about. This was a major case at the time. So I'll wrap up this video here. Thank you.